COVID-19 pandemic has clearly been a watershed moment in the history of humankind, and there is no debate about that. Was it just about the scars and the scares and the gloom and the doom? I mean, there were a lot of lessons, and this entire event is about taking stock of those lockdown lessons and the impact of the pandemic on the self and the society. So to analyze that and to engage in a meaningful discussion, we are honored to have two distinguished panelists. So that is Jan Heisig. He's a professor of sociology at the Freie University Berlin, and Paromita Vohra is an Indian filmmaker, and she's also an author and a newspaper columnist. Any specific thing that aptly captures the whole essence of the pandemic in your mind, Jan?
Related to the theme of proximity and distance is really these pictures that we saw a lot of early on in the pandemic, where people, could not really be close to loved ones in the way they would want to be, right? Especially people who were suffering from the pandemic. I think there are also lots of positive pictures in the sense that really capture the joy of reuniting, of reunion that people experienced when, thanks to vaccines, thanks also to just case numbers going down for other reasons like seasonality, which is a big factor in Germany, people could finally meet with friends and family again. So these are also kind of more positive pictures that stick to mind.
Paromita, in your viewpoint, what are the images that come to your mind?
But I think for me, the most striking image that remains in my mind is of the migrant workers trying to walk home because it was summer, it was very hot, the road was deserted, and there were only the workers. And I think that it sort of was emblematic of the difficulty of our society as a whole, suddenly brought up at the moment of the pandemic hitting us. I live in Bombay, a very noisy city, like most Indian cities, and the deathly silence of the first few weeks has really stayed with me.
So anything that you want to share about the emotional or the mental impact of the pandemic in the backdrop of our theme for the day, which is proximity and distance?
Gender-based violence became exacerbated, and that for women who had been able to leave home for some time, at least in the day, and have some life of their own outside, that became really tough. And so, yes, the overwhelming burden of childcare, of domestic work was all on women, even in many different kinds of social strata. Yeah. I mean, you of course had very exhibitionistic social media posts by men about how they're learning to make chapatis and how cute that is. But that only actually revealed to you how disproportionate is the share of labor at home. I think we had a lot of young people writing to us on Agents of Ishq about these issues of emotional difficulty, of mental health crises, of not being able to afford mental health care because we don't have enough infrastructure. If you were a queer person and you were forced to go home to a family that's homophobic or in any way repressive, that was difficult for people.
Many of the groups that you pointed to are also the ones who were most negatively affected in terms of mental health in Germany. So on the one hand, we have the loneliness issue, partly among older people, but especially among younger adults. And I think that's something that has been overlooked or at least not had received the amount of attention it should have in the German debate, that young adults were really suffering mentally in the pandemic. And on the other hand, we of course have this problem of overwork, overburdening, particularly on mothers. So there's lots of data showing this.
In your research, Jan, what is it that you found out about a very developed, a progressive nation like Germany? Did you find that inequity even there, and to what extent did it play out during the pandemic?
Inequities, or inequalities, as I would normally call them, they certainly increased in a lot of respects. So we already talked about education, where I think we have good evidence from a lot of high-income countries, with some exceptions, that inequalities increased. And then I think the next issue is obviously the direct health impact of the pandemic in terms of physical health. Who is at greater risk of infection, and given infection, who has a greater risk of developing severe disease and or even dying. And in all countries, basically, including the high-income countries with very strong universal healthcare system, we're seeing strong inequalities in the impact of the pandemic on that level, which has to do with, well, things such as occupational exposure, also, so meaning, how likely are people to contract the virus on the job. So this is definitely skewed towards low-income populations. Of course, there are also some high-income groups like doctors who have higher risks of exposure, but overall, it's definitely skewed towards low-income populations. And then these populations also, because of, well, persistent inequalities in the kinds of work they do, the level of stress they experience because of economic insecurity, because of, kind of the stress that comes with, managing a full-time job and then a family also on little resources, all kinds of stress. They tend to be in lower health regardless of the pandemic, which just makes them more vulnerable.
Right. Our last segment is about what is going to stay with us. Reflections that you may want to share.
When it comes to digitalization, the way we work, I think we will see lasting changes. So I definitely think that some mix of mobile work, home office will become, or they will stay more prevalent than they used to be before the pandemic. I also think that both employees really learn to enjoy it, but more importantly, employers learn that many of their fears about how productive employees would be, or so when they work in home office, proved to be wrong. So I think it actually was very effective in reducing fears about mobile work and home office among employers. So we'll see lasting changes there.
Oftentimes when we're told what do you forecast for the future, and then you're told there's a trend, we're actually being asked to accept a trend rather than asked what is it that you would like for the future. And I think there are two very different kinds of questions, right? So yes, is technology important? I mean, it's important, it's an inevitable part of our lives. So if you take something like home delivery, the fact that we now on Swiggy will go to Instamart, I order a lot of my groceries online, whereas I can get them very easily by making a phone call to my neighborhood Kirana shop because I live in Bombay, but there is a habit of supporting Swiggy. But the flip side of Swiggy is that it survives on gig work economy, without which that technology will fail, right? So it's not really technology. It continues to be tremendous economic exploitation, which is making that technology survive, right? So I would say these are important questions to ask.
Let's just continue with the business of life with more care, with more social distancing, and of course masking. Thank you so much for being a lovely audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.